Hello, I'm Russell Rowland. This is The Song of Roland, a podcast about American culture. And today I'm going to talk about my favorite Western films. I grew up in Montana during the 60s, so it was the heyday of Western films and television, kind of toward the end of the heyday, actually. The 50s were probably the high point for westerns. I mean, every single TV station just was loaded with westerns, and I don't know what percentage of films made in those days were westerns, but anyway, I grew up with that, and so as a kid, of course, I was completely enamored with the form. And then I grew older and ended up living in a lot of different places, and came to see the Western from a different perspective. And I talk about this a lot in my latest book, Be a Man Raised in the Shadow of Cowboys. I talk a lot about how those films and TV shows sort of formed my perspective about how to deal with life as a man, um, in both good and bad ways. I think one of the positive things about Westerns was that they had a very solid moral code, a strong foundation of, this is how people should treat each other and how they should behave. There was also, obviously, as time has shown us, a lot of misogyny and racism in those old films. But, also some incredible storytelling. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is some of those old classic films that were really good, but also how the genre has changed over the years, and how a lot of filmmakers have taken a very different perspective of the West and explored some of the darker parts of it, but also taken a much more well-rounded look at the role of women and Native Americans, and sadly, my list is not as well represented for films that feature Native American characters as it could be, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there just hasn't been enough of those films made. Um, so I'm going to kind of go from the least to my favorites, and I'm going to start with True Grit, not the John Wayne version, but the Coen Brothers version, which starred Jeff Bridges and Matt Damon. And sadly, I forgot to write down the name of the young woman who plays Maddie, who was absolutely phenomenal in this film. And so that's a bad oversight on my part. What was fantastic about this film, and it's lifted directly from the book by Charles Portis, is this young woman's perspective on the West. She's a young woman who lost her father. She's decided she's going to track down the man who killed him. And she hires the Jeff Bridges character to help her with that. Rooster Cogburn is his name. It's just a great story about a young woman who is completely determined to make things happen, and a grumpy old drunk guy who, is well known for his ability to track people down. So, she goes to him for a reason. Um, but he's kind of obviously toward the end of his career, and so he's a reluctant participant. So there's a lot of great humor, but also it's just a great portrayal of how a young woman could sometimes break through some of the old stereotypes and bring bring some action into the story. The book is incredible. I had never read the book until I was teaching a graduate class at St. Mary's College in California. And one of my students says, "You've got to read True Grit. It's one of the best Western books ever written." And, I kind of blew him off for a while. And then I finally picked it up and thought, well, I'll give it a try. And I was completely blown away. Charles Portis was a phenomenal writer. So, True Grit, number one. or number 20, actually. I have a pretty long list here, 20 films. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and of course, this is a classic. The story of how this film came about and how Paul Newman insisted on Robert Redford as his co star is a great story. George Hill was the director, and he had a pretty good track record of making interesting Western films anyway. So again, this is it's kind of revisionist history a little bit, but it also brings a lot of humor, like True Grit. The chemistry between these two guys was clear. It also does a very good job of exploring how the Wild West really was dangerous for people who decided to live a life of crime. Butch Cassidy, as has been determined through the years, was kind of one of those popular criminals because he actually did do some things that were philanthropic and tried to help other people with some of the money that he stole. And of course, like most criminals, they also had their trials as far as trying to keep the gravy train rolling, which is part of the reason they ended up in Brazil. It's hard to make a list of good westerns without including Butch Cassidy. Next is actually another Coen Brothers film. And I was actually going to try to not use more than one from different directors, but it's just hard to overlook No Country for Old Men as well. Javier Bardem is incredible as just like the most cold-blooded murderer in history. And Josh Brolin is really good as the sheriff. And again, this is a terrific story that explores some of the darker parts of the Western history in a little more contemporary setting. Just fabulous performances all around in that film. Next on the list is The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. I've wondered why this film didn't do better. It's got an amazing cast. Brad Pitt plays Jesse James. Ben Affleck's brother Casey plays Robert Ford. The best part about this film is that it does a really good job of showing how a small group of outlaws who are, worked together for quite some time, including Jesse James's brother Frank, develop this paranoia among the group, like they don't really fully trust each other. So there's always this kind of jockeying for position and wondering who's stabbing who in the back. And of course that's eventually the catalyst for this story is that Robert Ford does kill Jesse James, shoots him in the back. I thought this was one of Brad Pitt's better performances, and I'm a big fan of his anyway. But yeah, he was really good in this film as a guy who's, kind of got a tenuous hold on his leadership in this small band of outlaws. And Casey Affleck was also incredible. In fact, I think he was nominated for an Oscar for this role. The next one is a Sergio Leone movie, but it's not one of the Clint Eastwood ones, although I'm a big fan of the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly too. But Once Upon a Time in the West was Sergio Leone's best film, in my opinion. And part of the reason it was so good was that it had Henry Fonda was cast as like the meanest outlaw. Like the opening scene shows him shooting this family, and there's this little kid standing there, the only one surviving. And one of the other guys in his band says, "What are you going to do, Frank?" And Henry Fonda turns to the guy and says, "Well, now that you've said my name, I don't have any other choice." And he turns back and shoots this kid. So they establish right away that this guy is just, one of the coldest blooded killers and outlaws in the West. It also has a really good cast. Charles Bronson is in this film. And like most of Sergio Leone films, it's got some humor in it as well. But he was just one of those directors, even though he was Italian, that sort of managed to capture the stoic nature of Western men and bring that to film. Next is The Searchers, classic John Ford with his usual star, John Wayne. Those two made a lot of films together, a lot of westerns especially. But this one had a little different twist to it. John Wayne's character in this film, and I should have written down his name, but I didn't. But his family is killed by Native Americans, and they kidnap his niece, who's played by Natalie Wood. And so the main character decides he's going to track her down. And it's one of John Wayne's better performances because he plays this guy instead of his usual, like, noble, I'm going to do the right thing here. He's almost kind of psychopathic in this film. Like, he's determined to find this woman, but also to just kill as many Native Americans as he can. Some young dude plays his cousin or something, and he's also good in this. But yeah, this is a John Wayne film, all the way. And like I said, it's one of his better performances because he allows himself to explore some of the darker sides of that part of the American cowboy mythology, which was, sort of psychopathic. And of course, also part of what makes it interesting is that when he does find her, she has completely found a home with this Native American tribe that she's with. She doesn't want to leave, but he makes her leave. And of course, she then attempts to escape several times. So there's a lot of interesting plot twists in this film. It's just really well made. Next is High Noon. High Noon, of course, stars Gary Cooper, and he's a Montana hero because he grew up in Helena, Montana, which is where I'm not from Helena, but I'm from Montana. Gary Cooper personified the American West in ways that a lot of other actors weren't able to because he lived it to some extent. One of the things that's interesting about that film is that it puts this guy, the sheriff, into a ethical position where he has to decide whether he's going to stay and protect his town from a group of outlaws that are coming into town and just planning to wreak all kinds of havoc, or to leave with his new bride who doesn't want him to stay. So it's a good film about some of the choices that men had to make in those days as far as whether they were going to try to live up to this code that was kind of unrealistic in a lot of ways, or whether they were going to be able to save their own skin and live out some kind of life with their families. One of the things that made that film really effective was that it was shot in black and white, so some of the shots are just amazing, especially when it comes to the big showdown scene. So next on the list is a film called One-Eyed Jacks. And I just discovered this film about a year ago. I have a good friend here in Billings named Gordon McConnell. And Gordon does this great series at, we have this amazing little independent movie theater here in town that was started as a co-op. And it just is a great little theater. It serves food. You can take food into the theater. And they essentially just show independent films. Occasionally a big budget film will find its way there if it's an interesting one. Anyway, Gordon does a series there where he talks about some of the old westerns. Gordon is a very talented artist, painter, and he paints a lot of his paintings are like the anti-hero Western paintings. He has a little different take on Western history, which is one of the reasons we've become friends. So yeah, he shows some classic Western films, some of which are well known and some of which aren't as popular. And he talks about the history of them. And one of the films that he featured in his series is One-Eyed Jacks, which is the only film that Marlon Brando ever directed. And the way he became the director is an interesting story in and of itself. He became fascinated with this story when he read the novel, and Uh, Worked for years to try and get it made. They rejected screenplays by Rod Serling and one by Sam Peckinpah. And eventually, Stanley Kubrick agreed to direct this film. And Brando and Kubrick worked for months to prepare for filming. And just like 2 weeks before they were supposed to start filming, Marlon Brando had already become fairly eccentric and difficult as far as his working process. And the two of them had a very contentious relationship as they're trying to plan this thing. And Kubrick finally just said, I'm not going to do this. So Brando stepped in. And that's one of the reasons this film became kind of a classic, is because Brando had such a unique approach to everything that he did, that this film doesn't have a very traditional narrative form. So the basic storyline is that Brando plays this guy named Rio. He's a bank robber. His partner in crime is a guy named, this is hilarious, a guy whose first name is Dad. Of course, it's a nickname, but still, it kind of resonates because there's a lot of issues that come up in this film that are related to the relationship between these two men. And Brando had a very complicated relationship with his father, so there's always been a lot of speculation about um, the fact that this character was named Dad. He's played by Carl Malden, who's incredible in this movie. He was a frequent collaborator with Brando. They were together in Streetcar Named Desire. So they rob this bank. They escape, but they're tracked down and trapped on this hillside. They know about this place they might be able to go to get some horses to escape, but they realize that one of them has to stay where they are. Malden goes to get the horses, and he takes the money and bolts. He leaves Brando stranded, surrounded by all these um, law enforcement people. So the rest of the film is basically about how Brando decides, after spending some time in jail, how he's going to exact his revenge. But it's because of Brando's direction and because of the approach that he took toward acting. The relationship between these two guys is just way more nuanced and interesting than your typical Western. It's a love story. I mean, not in the sexual sense at all. Um, there's just a deep, you can tell throughout this movie that Brando feels a deep emotional wound from the betrayal. So it's not all about anger. It's about, feeling this hurt and rejection. He eventually does track down Dad, who has become a sheriff and a very highly respected businessman in this small town where he eventually settles down, thanks in part to the money that he got from this robbery. And they end up spending time together. The way that part of the story plays out is fascinating because Brando spends time in this town, sort of building up to what they both know is coming. So it's very different. And like I say, much more nuanced. It's just a much more deeper look at the relationship between two men than you usually see in a Western, mostly due to Brando's direction, I think. Of course, because of the way he went about his business, this thing went way over budget. It became one of those films that was notorious for that. And he would never direct it again, partly because he was also frustrated with the process, dealing with production people and all that, but also because nobody would hire him because he knew he would be a pain in the ass. So yeah, One-Eyed Jacks, highly recommend. Next is Days of Heaven. This was kind of Terrence Malick's breakthrough film. He went on to make a lot of other fantastic films, including The Thin Red Line. This is about a farm family. Richard Gere plays the husband, Brooke Adams plays the wife, and the young gal that plays, I think it's their niece, actually narrates the film. And it's one of the better voiceovers from a Western. She plays this young woman who's not very educated, but very articulate in her own way about what's happening. And of course, one of the things that Malick is best known for is his cinematography. He shoots these incredibly lush visuals, and that's what Days of Heaven is basically known for. Some of the most fantastic scenes as far as visually capturing the West ever filmed, but it's also just an incredibly great story too. Next is Unforgiven, and of course, you have to include Clint Eastwood somewhere along the line on this list. He made so many Westerns, and I'm not a huge Clint Eastwood fan. I think he perpetuated a lot of the stereotypes that do not serve this part of the country well, as far as portraying men who always responded to conflict with violence. Just didn't have a whole lot of depth as far as most of his characters, but this was an exception. And of course, part of the reason it was because he made a conscious effort for this film to be that way. The main character is a former gunfighter who has tried to get out of that life and has retired to this small farm where he's just living a quiet life, trying to stay out of the old life that he had. But when he finds out that someone has been killed, someone that's important to him, and someone recruits him to go after this guy. And of course, the bad guy is played by Gene Hackman in one of his better roles too. I think he won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for this film. It's one of these westerns that explores some of the old codes from a different angle. This man is struggling with trying to find a new way and to live, but he also feels an obligation to try to find some justice for this person that was killed. I think it won Best Picture. I can't remember for sure, but I definitely think it's one of Clint Eastwood's best films, and also obviously one of the best Westerns ever made. Now we're going to get into some more contemporary films. A lot of these are directed by women, which I think is also a very good trend that we're seeing as far as films made in the West. And this next film is one of them that's directed by a woman, directed by Chloe Zhao, who has gone on to direct Nomadland, starring Frances McDormand. And she also directed the film that's just coming out called Hamnet, which is the story of Hamlet, or Shakespeare and his wife. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that film. But the film that I'm talking about today is The Rider. This is a film starring a guy named Brady Janro. It's about a bull rider who suffers a severe head injury, so he has to retire from bull riding. The most interesting thing about this film is that Brady Janro was a bull rider who suffered a head injury and had to retire from bull riding. So he's basically playing himself. A lot of the guys that play his bull riding friends in the film are also actual bull riders, including one guy who's severely crippled from his bull riding days. He suffered a debilitating injury. It's a really great film about how a guy who has had this identity all wrapped up in his macho Western role as a bull rider has to find a new way in his life. And some of Brady Janro's family members also play his family members in this film, including his sister, who plays the sister, obviously. And I think his dad plays the dad, if I remember right. It's just an incredibly moving story of a young guy, not only trying to recover from a debilitating physical injury, but also addressing a lot of the emotional baggage that comes with being a Western man and having your identity stripped away. It's a very powerful film, The Rider. Next, another film directed by a woman director called First Cow. So Kelly Reichardt has become a very interesting filmmaker. There were actually 3 Western films that I could have included on this list that she made. It was hard to choose which one. One of them was called Certain Women, which was kind of Lily Gladstone's breakthrough film. That was a film shot in Montana that explored several different storylines from several different perspectives of different women. Michelle Williams was also in that film. I think Laura Dern was also in that film. So it was an incredible cast, a very quiet film that just did a wonderful job of bringing the woman's perspective into the story. But the film that I want to talk about is First Cow. Stars a young man named John Magaro, who's become a very interesting actor. First Cow is about these two young guys. It takes place very early on in when the West was first settled. They settled down in this little town. I think it's in the Pacific Northwest. One of them is a chef, and they decide to start making these little cakes that they sell on the street. But there's one problem with the people immediately fall in love with these cakes, but the problem is they need milk to make these cakes, and there aren't any cows in this region where they live. Cows have not made their way there yet, except there is one cow. So one of the local wealthy landowners has the first cow, which is where the title comes from. So these guys concoct a way of sneaking into this guy's pasture late at night, milking the cow, and making these cakes. And they become incredibly popular. But eventually, of course, somebody says, "Where are you guys getting the milk for these cakes?" And that's where things take an interesting turn. One of the things I love most about Westerns is that when they're well done, they're usually quiet, because, this is a place where most of the action is quiet. Most of the action takes place in quiet conversations between people. The old shoot 'em up Western scenes hardly ever happened in the real West. The battle at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds. So, most of what made the West interesting was that it was slow and kind of tedious, and the best films about the West explore that aspect of it. The next film is called Smoke Signals. This was basically one of the first films that came out with wide distribution that was written and directed by Native Americans. Sherman Alexie wrote the screenplay. It was directed by a Native American director named Chris Eyre. And it's just a fabulous look at reservation life. The thing that makes it really wonderful is that it's not completely bleak. I mean, it doesn't shy away from the fact that there's a lot of drinking, that there's a lot of poverty, but it captures the humor. And of course, Sherman Alexie is one of the funniest writers going, especially when it comes to writing about Native American culture. So he really brings that sense of humor that is very prevalent on Indian reservations. That's one thing that a lot of people don't realize. Smoke Signals is about these two guys who are basically just hanging around trying to figure out how to survive. There's just a lot of great humor and also a lot of poignant scenes between them and the other characters in this film. Smoke Signals, a classic. The next film is another one that is directed by a woman director. It's called East of Wall. This film just came out in the last 6 months or so, I believe. Like the writer, this film is based on a true story about a woman who lives in South Dakota. She's a horse trainer, and after her husband shot himself, she decided to start taking in these kind of wayward teens to help her train her horses. And again, like the writer I mentioned, the woman who plays the main character in this woman is actually a horse trainer who lost her husband to suicide and does train horses with these young teenage kids who are often come from very troubled backgrounds. And one of the things that makes this film very powerful and incredible is that the young woman who plays the mother, and geez, I should have written her name down. I wish I had done that. Her daughter plays her daughter, but she's an incredible horseman. So watching this young girl ride and teach the other kids how to train horses is just one of the best parts about the film. But this film also has an incredibly brilliant twist in it, in that there's a rich guy that befriends this woman. He sees some of her horses at an auction and recognizes immediately what an incredible horsewoman she is and how good she is at training horses. So he offers to help her financially, because it's clear that she's struggling. She's selling horses for way less than they're worth. But instead of turning this into like a white savior, she's white too, so that doesn't make sense. This male savior who's going to save this woman. They do form this partnership, and eventually he tries to take over and basically run the whole thing. At that point, and of course, you automatically think there's going to be this romance that develops between them two, which never happens. So it's an interesting veering away from the expected narrative that we've seen so many times in these kinds of films. Instead, she uses the help that he gives her to establish her own identity and her own business, and she breaks away from the old stereotype. It's just a beautifully made film, and again, visually, absolutely stunning, especially some of the scenes with the horses. Next, it's another film directed by a woman. This one got a lot more attention than a lot of these others did. It's called The Power of the Dog, and the reason that film got a lot of attention was because it was directed by the brilliant Australian director Jane Campion, who won Best Director for The Piano. She's kind of a maverick as far as not sticking to a certain, style. She likes to do different things. And, I need to mention my friend Alan Weltzine, who has played a huge role in reviving the career of the man who wrote The Power of the Dog, whose name was Thomas Savage. He grew up in Dillon, Montana. He was a gay man who ended up spending most of his life on the East Coast, but he wrote almost exclusively about Montana. It just wouldn't leave his blood, obviously. Power of the Dog, incredible performance by Benedict Cumberbatch. He plays a young guy who's inherited the ranch where he grew up, along with his brother, who's played by Jesse Plemons, and he's also incredible in this film. But the Cumberbatch character, he does not want to be there. He obviously sees himself as a cultured man. Of course, he's also closeted, which is part of what makes this story impactful. He's so angry, and it's barely contained. But he's also, good at his job. So he and his brother have this very tempestuous relationship, but they also manage to keep the ranch going. It's just a powerful story of a man struggling with himself and his anger affecting everyone around him. All the performances in this film are incredible. Jesse Plemons' real life wife, she plays his wife in this film as well. Great performances all around. Next is a little bit older film called Lonely Are the Brave. This is a film that's based on a book by the guy who wrote The Monkey Wrench Gang, Edward Abbey. And it's directed by a guy named David Miller, who didn't do a lot of films that did very well. But this film starred Kirk Douglas, and by all accounts, it was his favorite role ever. He plays this guy who's stuck in the past. He's worked on ranches his whole life, and he still has the old cowboy mentality. This film was shot in the early 60s, so it was really way ahead of its time. Jenna Rollins plays a young woman who's in love with this guy. And of course, Jenna Rollins is always incredible. This was one of her earlier starring roles. But Kirk Douglas is really the driving force that makes this film great, because he's just so deluded about his role in the world. There's this incredible scene where he's trying to ride his horse across, he doesn't even have a driver's license, so he's trying to ride his horse across a freeway. And it's just a great symbol of, a guy who's stuck in a world that he doesn't understand or want to understand. The next film, again directed by a woman. The director's name is Maggie Greenwald, and the film is called The Ballad of Little Joe. Susie Amos is the star of this film. She plays this young woman who finds her way west because she marries a guy. So she ends up out in the middle of nowhere and he dies. And she decides, after experiencing some pretty awful things from some of the men in the region, she decides to move to a different town and disguise herself as a young man. Susie Amos is amazing in this film. Even though she's this very slight redheaded woman, she does a very believable job of turning herself into this little guy who's just as tough as he needs to be to survive. Susie Amos just does an incredible job of capturing a woman who's and I think this was based on a true story, if I remember right. They actually didn't discover that she was a woman until she died. It's very well done. Next is Shane. Shane is a classic. Shane is one of my favorite movies ever made. It's directed by George Stevens, who directed a lot of great Westerns. He directed Giant. Alan Ladd plays the main character in this film. And he's a drifter who ends up showing up at this ranch, this young family who's struggling to get by in the middle of nowhere. They have this tiny little ranch that's just big enough to make a living on. And of course, the bad guys are this neighboring ranch where the owner wants to swallow up all the smaller ranches around. So the owner of this ranch is working hard to try to rally all of the other small operators that are living in the same area to fight this guy. And Shane shows up, and of course he's a famous gunfighter who, kind of like the guy in Unforgiven, is trying not to reveal who he is, but somebody recognizes him, and before he knows it, he gets caught up in this conflict that's happening in this community, and there's no way of avoiding becoming involved. One of the most powerful closing scenes ever, when Shane rides off and the young boy who is the son of the ranch family and has become completely enamored with Shane is, calling to him, waving goodbye. Just very sad. Classic. Wonderful film. And actually, the screenplay was written by one of the best writers from Montana from that period anyway, A.B. Guthrie, who wrote a couple of books that were made into Westerns. The films were not as good as the books. The Way West, especially, was an incredible book. Kirk Douglas, again, bought the rights for The Way West and The Big Sky and made them both into films that were really just not that great. But good, a good writer. So he wrote the screenplay for this one. Next is Lonesome Dove, which, as you probably know, is not a film but a series. In my opinion, the best miniseries ever made, especially about the West. Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall play a couple of guys who are leading this group of cowboys taking a herd from Texas up to Montana. They eventually end up in Miles City, Montana. And Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall are just amazing in this series. It's one of those film series that captures the stoic, sort of emotionally shut down guys in a way that doesn't feel overdone. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Larry McMurtry wrote the book and worked on the screenplay as well. And he's one of the best writers from the West that we ever had, because he was able to portray that aspect of the West in a way that wasn't glamorizing it. He captures the fact that these guys actually suffered from that attitude in not being able to develop close relationships. And when conflict comes up, they don't know how to talk about it. It just captures the whole spirit and the sort of the culture of the West in a way that nobody really ever has done as well. And of course, the The supporting cast is also amazing. Angelica Houston, Diane Lane, Frederick Forrest is incredible as the cold-blooded native who's tracking these guys down. His name's Blue Duck, and that's an incredible performance as well. Also, Ricky Schroeder, who, before this was basically known as the young kid on Silver Spoons. He does an amazing job playing this young kid who turns out to be the son of one of the two main characters. Great performances all around. Okay, last and not least, my favorite Western ever made, directed by Robert Altman, and I think this was pretty much his only Western that he ever made, because Robert Altman didn't like to be pigeonholed. He made films that were all over the map. One of my favorite directors. The film is called McCabe and Mrs. Miller. It stars Julie Christie as Mrs. Miller and Warren Beatty as McCabe. And the thing that makes this film so brilliant is the authenticity. Warren Beatty plays this guy who's just not very smart, who shows up in this small town and decides to start a whorehouse. But not too long after he arrives, this woman who's a very experienced madame shows up, and that's Mrs. Miller. And she has all of her girls with her. And the two end up forming this partnership. And of course, McCabe is completely in over his head as far as being able to control anything, because Mrs. Miller is so much smarter than he is. So it's a wonderful exploration of something that actually plays out often in the West, which is that, as much as the men would like to think they're in charge and would like to think they're smarter than the women, they usually aren't. And this film captures that perfectly. Beatty and Julie Christie, their performances are absolutely incredible. It also has the classic Leonard Cohen soundtrack, which was just a perfect complement to this really beautifully filmed, the cinematography in this film, again, is so beautiful. It's constantly blurry, so everything feels so much colder. The colors are muted. Just beautifully shot, beautifully written, and perfectly performed. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, perfect Western film. So that's my list. 20 Western films that I really admire. And I wanted to throw out a few as honorable mentions, and some of these could have easily made the list, especially Blazing Saddles, which is probably my favorite Mel Brooks film. It's right up there between that and Young Frankenstein. Little Big Man, another film that took a very unique approach to the Western myths. Probably the first comedy that sort of poked fun of all the macho Western stereotypes. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a wonderful film starring Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne. That's another film that has an interesting take on the difference between a real cowboy and someone who comes west and tries to play that role. Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch is a fascinating film starring Johnny Depp that was very unique for its time. My Darling Clementine is another good one. So that's my honorable mention list. I'd love to hear your favorite Westerns, so please post your opinions down in the comments. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to The Song of Roland, podcast about American culture. And I want to thank my friend Stephen Gillis of DeZonk Books for sponsoring this podcast. My friend Tiffany Hauk is a wonderful producer, and my son Fletcher provides the musical transitions for this podcast. Thanks again.